Hi everyone, it's Rand here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you are well today. Today we're going to be talking about the history of introverted intuition. It's a topic that I have embraced for a while now, and I'm even considering writing a book about it at some point. So I'm still exploring ideas at the moment, and I'd like to share more of those ideas with you. Specifically today, we're going to be talking about the convergences between Pragmatism and Buddhism from the perspective of NI and from the perspective of the history of NI. Before I move on, just to remind you that I have written a book on the INFJ personality called the Ecstatic Soul. It's a deepest investigation of the INFJ you'll find online. If you have a good understanding of the type, but you would like to go further to get a sense of what the INFJ consciousness is like, what its existential condition is like, and solutions to live a fulfilled life at an existential level, this is the book to get. Less than $10, ebook, paperback format. All the links are available in the description box down below to all the Amazon websites. If you have any questions, if you don't find a link, just shoot a question and I will get back to you. Right, so the history of introverted intuition is different from the history of the concept of introverted intuition. And I think that here I have to clarify a little bit what I mean, because someone commented on one of my videos on the topic recently and made a fair point. In fact, their comment did not make a particularly good or bad point, but it could be inferred from the question that I had failed to clarify something prior to them asking the question. The person said, when are you going to address the question? What is going to be the time frame for addressing the question of the history of introverted intuition, knowing that introverted intuition was only invented in 1921 by Carl Jung in his book Psychological Types? And so, this offers me an opportunity to correct this assumption. My plan is not to write the history of how introverted intuition evolves from Carl Jung onwards. That would be the history of the concept of introverted intuition. And I think it's a worthwhile approach in some respects, but it's not the approach that I want to follow. So pay attention to the distinction between the history of the concept of introverted intuition and the history of introverted intuition and the concept it creates to represent itself. There's a distinction between the two. Now, maybe this sounds a little bit abstract, so let me try to clarify this. History of the concept of introverted intuition is pretty straightforward. Essentially, it is tracing the evolution of the concept from its first appearance in Carl Jung's book, Psychological Types, 1921 to 2021. The concept is officially 100 years old in, even very modern models that are offered on YouTube, for instance. Now, the history of introverted intuition is a different thing because it takes the concept of introverted intuition for granted as an explanatory concept of how some people behave, how some people are cognitively made up, in their psyche. So if you take the concept of introverted intuition as a basic concept of how you interpret the reality of personality, this becomes a concept that you can deploy to account for historical developments in thought, not from 1921, but essentially from the beginning of time, or at the beginning of recorded time. And what I'm interested in is not how introverted intuition as a self-conscious concept evolved, but how in the works and thought of recognized introverted and intuitives from the pre-Socratics and Plato onward on the Western side and from Hinduism and Buddhism on the Eastern side onwards, we see introverted intuition of course, not giving itself the name introverted intuition, but nevertheless conceiving of itself after a certain fashion, which we, or I as the historian, can reconstruct as different stages in the life of introverted intuition. So not the history of the concept as employed word for word in the literature, introverted intuition, but the history of this aspect of the psychical makeup of many human beings. And this brings me to an additional and perhaps the most interesting aspect of all this. It's something that probably transcends Carl Jung's work to an extent. And it's this idea that insofar as introverted intuition is a cognitive function of human beings, so not only was there introverted intuition prior to the invention of the actual concept introverted intuition, exactly in the same way that there was gravitation before Newton came up with the word gravitation, you understand? Well, in the same way, introverted intuition only exists as embodied in people. People, through different historical stages, different historical eras, develop new ways of thinking, new ways of intuiting things, new ways of remembering, new ways of representing, and also, importantly, new ways of representing themselves, new ways of understanding themselves. For the Greeks, human being was a soul, and the soul was made of three parts in a body. For Plato, the soul was immortal and could exist apart from the body. For Aristotle, the soul was indissociable from the body. It was the form of the body, and of it only the intellect, the part of the soul called the intellect, survived the death of the body. Nevertheless, it's like this idea of an immaterial soul or a formal soul in a body. Now later on with Christianity, this concept of soul evolved. With Descartes in the Renaissance, the concept shifted dramatically into the concept of mind. So for Descartes, the distinction between the soul and the mind becomes so blurred that the soul essentially just disappears from view, and the concept of mind comes to add up all the previous characteristics of the soul, but is also reconceptualized in such a way as to be opposed to the realm of matter. Descartes famously says, "I think, therefore I am. I am a substance that thinks." So the first thing that I can be certain of, in other words, the first thing that my skepticism cannot kill off, is the certainty that I am a thinking thing. That establishes the domain of the thinking substance, mind. Later on is derived the concept of matter, of extended substance. Thinking, extensionless substance, mind, extended non-thinking substance, matter, okay? Mind and matter, dualism of mind and matter, dualism of mind and body. So after Descartes, we think of ourselves as minds with a subjectivity that is properly our own. Each of us is an I with a subjectivity relating to a domain of objects, which is the realm of matter. So you see how there are lots of progressive self-conceptions, and the conceptions of human beings nowadays, influenced by Kant and many others, is the idea that we are born with inalienable rights, human rights, that are transcendental and that are not dependent on context or historical epoch. That didn't exist in Descartes. So you see there's a constant evolution of human beings' understanding of who they are. And when I want to write the history of NI, the history of introverted intuition, I essentially want to provide a narrative where I'm saying we can look at important, influential introverted intuitives. We can start perhaps with Heraclitus, pre-Socratic. Let's focus on the Western side for a second. Start from Heraclitus, the philosopher of the flux, everything flows, etc., etc. Move on to Plato, then we can move to Plotinus, We can also talk about Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic. If we want, we can also even inject Jesus, even though he's not a thinker as such. He's an important historical figure in the history of introverted intuition. And then we can move forward to some medieval thinkers, and then we can move to Spinoza in the Renaissance. I'm talking exclusively, notice, about NI dominance here. And then we can move to Schopenhauer, and then we can move to Wittgenstein, etc. So, if you like, there is a clear path that connects different introverted and intuitives. At least I want to argue that there's a clear path that also delineates the evolution of the self-representation of introverted intuition. And to me, the reconciliation between Buddhism and pragmatism is not something that actually has happened yet in history. It's something that I predict. I decided that since I was an anti-dominant, I might as well stop being coy and start making predictions, because anti-dominants tend to love making predictions. So my prediction is that at some point, I cannot tell exactly when, the next incarnation of introverted intuition will be a reconciliation between East and West, between what I have called alienation, the history of Western thought, productive, chaotic, constantly reinventing itself, creative, etc., and the history of Eastern thought, more oriented toward quietude, quietism, enlightenment, a lot less chaotic, seeking tranquility, more conservative in a sense, but also closer to existential fulfillment. So how can there be a reconciliation between these two in the future? Obviously, this is a theme that I could insert at the end of my book. For example, if I were to write a book on the history of introverted intuition, I dedicate the first chapters, the bulk of the book, to tracing that history, and then I could maybe have 1 or 2 chapters of, making predictions, trying to anticipate what the future will be like on the basis of what's happened before. At the moment, it seems that there is, on the Western side, still a firm commitment to what you might call alienation in the commitment to metaphysics, because there's still very much this commitment. Another worldly metaphysics that is not the here and now of this material world. But there is also this strand of pragmatism that essentially follows from Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein, and has been usefully repurposed by Richard Rorty, the INTJ Richard Rorty, who's a neo-pragmatist, passed away 15 years ago, but said, every language that we speak is like Wittgenstein says, a language game that we can use to update our vocabularies to achieve new purposes. So when we speak the language of metaphysics, we're not pointing to the existence of realm beyond. We're maybe trying to just achieve new purposes for this world here. And that's what we do with new vocabularies. New vocabularies are distinguished by their use, what they can do for us, what they can help us create that was not there before, rather than pointing to or representing the world beyond. So that's the neo-pragmatism of Richard Rorty via Wittgenstein. And I think that's a doctrine, if you like, a philosophical movement that's a revival of the earlier pragmatism of the early 20th century, mainly American, which had fallen into a certain kind of obsolescence, but has been revived, and I think it's here to stay because it's grappling at very important questions. And on the Eastern side, you have something like a Buddhism, and I'm only looking at Buddhism, but I could be looking at other Eastern philosophies, that is becoming more and more, as far as I can tell, skeptical of its own underlying metaphysics inherited from early and middle Buddhism. Because if you look at early and middle Buddhism, you'll have to admit that there is a metaphysics that points to, sure, there being just one world. So you have the monism that indicates a path toward enlightenment. But at the same time, this world is still supposed to be underlying what we see. In other words, there is one world, but it's not this world. This world is just like is just like the top of the iceberg. So it's part of the whole one world, but it's just like one particular expression that we can see when we are not enlightened like the Buddha, when we have not attained nirvana. And so it refers to the five sankhas, the physical parts, feelings, volitions, consciousness, and so on, as being the basic elements of the universe. It's a metaphysics that is predicated still on sight, because only the Buddha is supposed to be able to see what is really there. And so I think here we have a concept of NI that is definitely oriented to enlightenment, but it's not really there without the metaphysics. So what seems to be the implication is that even on the Eastern side, and maybe contrary to some of the hypotheses I've made before, Buddhism and Eastern religions as a whole are on the path to enlightenment. They're not quite there yet. And my prediction is that there will be a unification between NI, Western NI and Eastern NI, if you like. And that is this dissolution. Because the pragmatism of Western NI, the late Wittgensteinianism of the Western NI, if it could infiltrate Buddhism in such a way as to say this is a vocabulary to achieve for a certain purpose, then the purpose of enlightenment could be attained, because eventually the metaphysics will be discarded as just a vocabulary. And then there will be nothing left in the path of attaining enlightenment in the midst of this world that we can see here and now, with no need of this hidden world of metaphysics, whether dualistic or monistic. Now, this has been a little bit long, but I'd love to hear if you like this train of thought and the ideas that underlie it. And if you'd like me to explore more precisely, more accurately, and maybe more eloquently in a future book. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day. Consider dropping me a like and giving me a comment. I'll talk to you soon. And maybe consider subscribing as well if you're so inclined. Bye-bye.